For 20 years, she came at 6:10 every morning, and on a Tuesday in the dry season, she did not come. And the silence she left behind was the first thing in 2 decades that ever made the big house on Lagos Avenue in East Legon stop and listen. The gate man waited at his post and looked down the road and did not see the small woman in the gray head wrap walking up from the Trotro stop, the way he had seen her walk up 4,000 mornings. The laundry baskets sat untouched in the back court. The taps in the wash house stayed dry. Somewhere inside the house, a woman with 11 domestic staff and a wardrobe worth more than the street pressed an intercom button and asked where the washerwoman was, and no one had an answer, because no one had ever needed one. She had always simply been there, the way the water was there, the way the morning was there. And what none of them understood yet, not the gate man, not the house staff, not the woman pressing the intercom, was that the hands that had been quietly leaving that house for 20 years were the only hands in the country that could do the one thing that house was, that very week, about to need more than anything in the world. Her name was Abina Owusu Boateng, and she was 56 years old. She weighed 51 kilograms, and her forearms below the rolled sleeves were corded and hard in a way that does not come from a gym. The muscle laid down over 30 years of wringing wet cloth by hand, because wringing by hand is the only way to protect a fiber you respect. She wore a faded gray head wrap and a brown housecoat she had patched at both elbows with cloth cut from an older housecoat, and rubber slippers worn smooth and pale at the heel. The clothes were old. The clothes were spotless because a woman who has spent her life making other people's cloth clean does not walk around in cloth that is dirty, and she would have considered it a kind of lie to do so. Around her neck, under the housecoat where no one ever saw it, she wore a thin cord with a small flat piece of carved wood on it, and a Dinkra stamp the size of a coin, the symbol Guy Niame cut into it by hand. And the wood had been worn shiny by her thumb because she touched it the way other people check a pocket for keys. The carved stamp had belonged to her father. Abina had not always washed clothes for the rich. She had been born in Antonso, in the Ashanti region, where the Adinkra cloth is made, in a family that had stamped and dyed ceremonial cloth for 4 generations, and as a girl she had stood at her grandmother's elbow learning the secrets that are not written down anywhere, how the batty bark is boiled for 3 days, to make the dye, how the iron from the cooking pot is added at the right moment so the black becomes a black with no end to it. How royal kente that is 50 years old must be washed in cool water with the soap of a particular plant and never wrung but pressed. How a stain that would destroy an ordinary cloth can be lifted from a sacred one if you know which way the threads were laid. Then the workshop burned in 1989, and her father died 2 years after that of a grief he never named, and the land was sold to pay what was owed. And the craft that the family had carried for 100 years walked out of Ntonso in the hands of a quiet young woman who told no one in Accra what she knew, because no one in Accra had ever asked a washerwoman what she knew. She had come to the house on Lagos Avenue 20 years ago for one reason, and it was the smallest and most human reason there is. Her son Kwame was 3 years old. His father was gone, and a child must eat, and a child must go to school. And the advertisement at the junction said a wealthy household needed someone to hand-wash delicate clothing and was willing to pay 300 cedis a month. 300 cedis a month is what raised Kwame Owusu Boateng from a 3-year-old on her back to a 17-year-old with the highest marks in his year, and then carried him, on a scholarship she had wept over in the wash house where no one could see, onto a plane to study textile design in Florence. 2 years gone now and writing every month. Everything Abena had endured in that house, she had endured because 300 cedis a month, washed out of other people's collars, was the rope she was throwing forward to her son. She did not need the world to know her. She needed her boy to land somewhere soft. The woman who employed her was Madame Constance Asante, and she was not a monster in the way stories like to make people monsters. She was 51 and beautiful, and the wife of a man who owned 3 hotels and a stretch of the port, and she lived inside a kind of comfort that slowly removes a person's ability to see anyone whose comfort is smaller. She had never once called Abina by her name. For 20 years she had called her the washing woman, to her face, to her guests, on the phone. Give it to the washing woman. The washing woman will know. When Abina lifted a wine stain out of a French gown that the boutique in Osu had declared ruined, Madame Constance did not say thank you. She said, "Well, that is what she is for." When Abina's son left for Italy, and Abina mentioned it once, quietly hoping for nothing more than a nod, Madam said, "Italy? On a washerwoman's salary?" and laughed and turned back to her phone, and the laugh was not cruel in her own mind. That is the part that should sit with you. In her own mind, she was simply stating a funny fact. The house had its small rules of contempt, and the staff knew them, and they enforced them on each other the way the overlooked so often do. Abena ate her food standing in the back court, not at the staff table, because long ago the head cook had decided the washing woman smelled of soap. She used the outside tap. She was paid in cash, in an envelope, on the first of the month, and 3 times in 20 years the envelope had been short, and she had counted it in silence and said nothing. Because to a woman holding a rope to her son, the worst thing you can do is let go of the rope to make a point. The driver watched her struggle with the heavy baskets in the rain and stayed in the car. The other maids called her old lady. And on the days when Madame Constance had guests and wanted to seem warm, she would sometimes gesture at Abina across the court and say to her friends, 20 years, this one, faithful as a dog. And the friends would coo, and Abina would keep folding, and her thumb would find the small carved stamp under her housecoat and press it once the way you press a wound to keep it quiet. There was a thing she did with one particular cloth that no one in the house ever noticed, and it is the thing you must hold in your mind. Among Madame Constance's possessions, kept in a cedar trunk and brought out only twice a year, was an Edwinisa Kente, a king's cloth, every block of it filled with patterns so that no plain thread showed, the most prestigious weave there is, and it had been woven in bond wire in 1961. For Madame's late grandmother, who had been a market queen, and it was the single most valuable object in a house full of valuable objects, though Madame herself thought of it mostly as old. Twice a year, Abina was given this cloth to clean, and twice a year, Abina carried it to the wash house and locked the door at all. She laid it flat on a clean white sheet and went over it by hand, thread by thread, with cool water she had boiled and cooled, and a soap she made herself from a plant she grew in a pot behind the wash house. And she pressed where she could not rub, and she turned the cloth the way the weave wanted to be turned. And the whole time she did this, she hummed a song her grandmother used to hum in the dye yard in Tonso. She did it because she could not bear to see a cloth like that handled wrongly, and because for a few hours twice a year, with the door locked, she was not a washing woman. She was the last living daughter of a family that had clothed kings. She never told anyone. No one ever asked. If this is starting to sit in your chest the way I think it is, stay with me, because the morning she did not come walking up from the Trotro stop, everything that house had refused to see for 20 years was about to arrive all at once, and there would be nowhere left to put it. What made her stop was small, the way the thing that finally breaks a rope is always small. 2 weeks before that Tuesday, Madame Constance had hosted 40 guests for her daughter Adwo's traditional engagement, and in front of all 40 of them, looking for a laugh, she had pointed her glass at Abina where she stood folding napkins in the doorway, and she had said, "You see this one? I have washed my whole life through this one's hands. If she dropped dead tomorrow, I would have to teach a new one where the bleach is." The guests had laughed. Adwa, the daughter, had not laughed. She had looked at the floor because Adwa was 24 and had been folded into Abina's lap as a crying child more times than her own mother knew. And Abina had finished folding the napkins. She had not dropped them. She had not raised her face. She had set the last napkin down, squared the edges, and gone home on the Trotro, and she had sat on her bed in the single room on Spintex Road and held the carved stamp in both hands for a long time. And in the morning she did not get up at 5. She lay still and listened to the city wake without her, and at 6:10, for the first time in 20 years, she was not walking up Lagos Avenue. She had decided that the rope she had been throwing forward had reached the far shore. Kwame was safe, and a woman whose child is safe is a woman who can finally afford to be a person. She did not announce it. She did not send a message. She simply stopped the way water stops when the tap is finally closed. And the absence she left filled the house slowly, then all at once. The trouble for Madame Constance arrived 9 days later, and it arrived because of the Adwanasa cloth. Adwoa's full traditional wedding had been set, the date fixed, the whole of fashionable Accra invited, and the center of the entire occasion, the thing the photographers had been told about, the thing the bride would wear at the climax of the ceremony, was the 1961 king's cloth. The grandmother's Adwanasa passed down the female line. With Abina gone, and the wedding close, and the cloth needing its cleaning, Madame Constance had sent it impatiently to the most expensive dry cleaner in airport residential, a glass-fronted place with a French name and a machine for everything. And the machine, which knew nothing, had taken the 50-year-old vegetable-dyed silk and warm-washed it and pressed it under heat, and the colors had run and the oldest threads had shattered, and the most valuable object in the house had come back in a sealed bag, ruined, with a printed apology and an offer of compensation that was an insult to the very idea that such a thing could be compensated. Madame Constance had opened the bag in her dressing room and made a sound that no one in the house had heard her make before, and then she had been silent for a long time. The way a person is silent when they finally understand they have broken something they cannot buy. She called the museum, she called the cultural center, she called the boutiques and the curators, and a professor at Legan, and every single one of them said a version of the same sentence, which was that a cloth in that condition could not be restored by any process or machine, that the knowledge of how to lift heat-set vegetable dye and relay the threads of an old Adwanasa without destroying it had effectively died with the old generation of Intonso, and that there was, perhaps, in the whole country, one person still believed to hold it, and when Madame Constance, desperate now, asked who, the professor at Legan went quiet on the phone and then said that there had been a master family at 1989 and that the line was thought to be lost, but that in the craft world there was a name people still spoke softly. The daughter who had survived, who had vanished into the city, whose hands had been trained by the last of the true dyers. He said the name, Awusu Boateng. He said it the way you say the name of someone half legend. And Madame Constance Asante sat down in her dressing room, holding a ruined king's cloth, and could not understand why the name felt like a hand closing around her throat. It was the daughter, Adwoa, who put it together, because Adwoa was the one person in that house who had ever really looked at Abina. She remembered the humming. She remembered the locked washhouse door twice a year. She remembered, from when she was small, Abina's hands turning a cloth as if it could hear her. And she said very quietly into her mother's silence, "Mama, the washing woman. Her name is Abina Owusu Boateng, who sold thread and trimmings at a stall in the Medina market and had known Abina's family in the old days. And it was Auntie Pauline who Adwoa found after 3 days of asking. And Auntie Pauline who said, sucking her teeth at the whole sorry business, you people kept a queen in your backyard and called her a dog. Yes, I know where she stays, but you will not send a driver. If you want her, the mother goes herself, and the mother goes humble, or you can bury that cloth." What Auntie Pauline said next, in the low voice of someone who has watched the world get things wrong her whole life, was the thing that changed the direction of everything that followed. She said, "And there is one coming to this city next week who will want to meet that woman more than your daughter's wedding wants its photographs. Be careful how you treat her before he gets here." The one who was coming was Nana Kofi Boahen, the keeper of the royal textile collection at Manhaya, the highest living authority on the cloth of the Ashanti court, an old man whose word could place a weaver in history or leave them out of it. And he was coming to Accra to assemble a heritage exhibition of living masters, and he had, for 11 years, been quietly searching for any surviving member of the Intonso family whose dye black was said to have no bottom to it. He had nearly given up, and then a professor at Legan had called him about a ruined Adwanasa and a name spoken softly in a rich woman's dressing room. Madame Constance went to Spintex Road herself. She had never in her life climbed the kind of narrow concrete stairs she climbed that afternoon, and she stood outside a single rented room in her good shoes holding a sealed bag, and when Abina opened the door and saw who it was, she did not invite her in, and she did not turn her away. She simply waited. With the stillness of a woman who has nothing left to prove to anyone, Madame Constance opened her mouth to speak the way she always spoke, from above, and found she could not. She looked at the small woman in the doorway, 56 years old, 51 kilograms, a carved stamp on a cord now visible at her open collar, and something in the way Abina stood made the words, "the washing woman," impossible to say ever again. She held out the bag. She said, "I have ruined my grandmother's cloth. They tell me you are the only person alive who can save it. I have no right to ask you." And then Madame Constance Asante, who had laughed at this woman in front of 40 guests, did the thing that 20 years had said she would never do. She lowered her head. Abina did not gloat. The framework of her whole life had no room in it for gloating. Gloating is for people who still need something from the people who wronged them, and she no longer needed anything from Madame Constance at all. She took the bag, she opened it on her own small table, and looked at the ruin with her hands, reading the damage thread by thread the way another person reads a page, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said 3 words. She said, "It can be saved." And then she said, looking up at the woman in the doorway, "But not by the washing woman, by Abina Owusu Boateng of Ntonso. You will say my name." It took her 19 days. She did it not in the wash house on Lagos Avenue, but in a clean room at the Cultural Center that Nana Kofi Bowen himself arranged the moment he arrived in Accra and learned, with an emotion the old man did not bother to hide, that the daughter of the Ntonso dyers had been found alive and washing collars in East Legon for 20 years. He came to watch her work. This man whose word was law in the world of cloth, and the people of the center saw him stand the whole first hour with his hat in his hands, and they understood from the way he stood that whoever this small woman was, she was someone because power recognizes power, and the only ones who perform it are the ones who lack it. He spoke to her very little, the way the truly significant always do. On the first day, he watched her boil the baity bark and said only, "Your father's method." On the day the black came back into the dead threads, deep and bottomless, he said, "There it is." And on the last day, when the king's cloth lay restored on the white sheet, 50 years lifted off it, its colors brought home, the old keeper looked at it for a long time and then said the sentence that ended the world Abena had been living in. He said, "This goes in the exhibition, with her name at the center." The reckoning did not come as revenge, because revenge is small, and what arrived was not small. There was no shouting at Madame Constance, no scene, no public shaming. There was only this: the wedding went ahead, and Adwoa wore the restored cloth, and at the center of the celebration, the master of ceremonies, who had been told the truth, named the woman who had brought a 50-year-old king's cloth back from death, Abina Owusu Boateng, master of Ntonso, last of her line. And 400 guests turned to look at a woman many of them had stepped past in that very house, and rose to their feet. And in the weeks after, the Heritage Exhibition opened at Mania with Abina's restored Adwanasa at its heart, and a placard with her name and her father's name and her grandmother's name. And the National Cultural Center announced, with Nana Kofi Bowen's blessing, the founding of a school of traditional cloth restoration at Ntonso, on the very ground where the workshop had burned in 1989, with one woman named as its master and keeper. Madame Constance was not punished. She was simply, permanently, no longer the most important person in any room that also held the washing woman, and she had to live the rest of her life in a city that now knew exactly whose hands she had laughed at. And that is a sentence that does not end. Kwame flew home from Florence for the opening of the school. He stood at the back of the crowd at Ntonso in a good suit he had bought with his own first wages, and he watched his mother cut the ribbon on the ground her family had lost. And he did the thing she had taught him without ever saying it aloud. And he did not weep where people could see. He just pressed his thumb to a small carved Adinkra stamp she had given him at the airport, the twin of the one she had worn under her housecoat for 20 years, and he held it. Madame Constance thought, for 20 years, that she had bought a pair of hands. But the truth is that those hands had never belonged to her, not for one single morning, not for any envelope of cash on the first of the month. Those hands belonged to 100 years of Ntonso, to a grandmother's dye yard, to a craft so rare the keeper of the royal collection had spent 11 years searching for it. And all that time it had been folding her napkins and lifting her wine stains and washing her collars in the back court, where she said it smelled of soap. She had owned the woman's labor. She had never once owned the woman's worth, because no one can, because worth is not a thing that can be bought with 300 CDs a month. And the day she finally understood the difference was the day she stood on a concrete stairway in her good shoes and could not bring herself to say the washing woman one more time. You can pay for a person's time. You can pay for their hours, their hands, their backs, their 20 years, but you cannot purchase what they carry, and you cannot tell from a patched housecoat and a gray head wrap the size of the thing that is standing quietly in your backyard. The people we are most certain we have measured are so often the ones we have not even begun to see, and the ones who serve us without complaint are not serving because they are small. Sometimes they are serving because they are throwing a rope forward to someone they love, and the silence we mistake for submission is the most enormous strength there is. And the last thing anyone saw of Abina Owusu Boateng was not a small woman folding napkins in a doorway. It was a woman standing in the cool of an open-walled workshop in Ntonso in the late afternoon. The smell of boiling Beatty bark in the air, 11 young apprentices at the long tables learning the way to turn an old cloth so it does not tear. Her father's stamp now mounted in a frame on the wall above the door. Her hands moving over a length of new black cloth that had no bottom to its black. A woman who had been called faithful as a dog for 20 years, standing at the front of the room that bore her name, teaching the country to remember what it had nearly let her carry into the ground alone. So before you go, let me ask you the question this story is really asking, and I want you to answer it honestly, because the easy answer and the true answer are not the same. How many people have served you without complaint, quietly, daily, for years, while you decided you already knew exactly who they were? The cleaner, the driver, the woman who washes, the one you call by their job instead of their name. And if one of them turned out to be a master, a queen, a keeper of something rare, would the shame you felt be because of who they turned out to be, or because of how little you ever bothered to look? Tell me in the comments. The real answer, not the polite one. I read every single one, and I want to read yours. And if this story moves something in you, stay with me and subscribe, because this is a channel about the people the world is too busy to see, the overlooked, the quiet, the ones holding something priceless in hands we walk straight past. There are more of their stories, and I will keep telling them as long as you keep listening. I'll see you in the next one.